Hi, Neil Harris is here from Gaithersburg.
Hello, Neil. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if you want to start, I think that would be appropriate.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ms. Pandek. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It has now reached the noon hour, so it's our appointed time to convene this month's September COG Board meeting. This is your COG Board Vice Chair, Christian Dorsey. I will be substituting for Chair Derek Davis, who was unfortunately called away on other matters this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us virtually for today's meeting. Recognizing that since we are, again, using our virtual platform, we do request your patience for any glitches or hiccups that may occur over the course of our time today. Please remember to keep your microphones muted at all times except for when you are seeking to be recognized to speak. That'll make sure our audio is clear for everyone. And then if you would like to speak, please sure to unmute your line. But then again, remember to remute it when you are concluded. And the chat box has become a very useful function for us for letting the administrative team know of any needs that arise, for posing any questions that you may have at any point during our discussion. So please use the chat box if you are participating via the platform. But rest assured, those of you who are calling in on the phone will have an opportunity to pose questions for each of our agenda items. So first, we're going to get started with our Pledge of Allegiance, and then I'll provide a reminder for how our logistics work during these virtual meetings. So if you all will join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the
flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, and with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we'll now move on with today's meeting. And after my initial remarks, our General Counsel, Sharon Pandek, who has been monitoring the participants box as you all have logged in, will complete the roll call to document all who are present for today's meeting. A reminder that our virtual meeting is being live streamed on the COG website, and it is available through our YouTube account. To facilitate questions and comments for our speakers during for our agenda items, we'd like for you to use one of two options. The first, as I mentioned before, is the chat function, where you can pose a question at any time. It's constantly monitored to make sure we can address those. After we facilitate questions from the chat box, those who are participating by phone only will have a great opportunity to have their questions recognized as I will go through calling for questions and comments by each of our respective jurisdictions. During votes, after a motion is properly made to adopt a resolution, we will proceed to a discussion. And after the discussion, I will ask for any abstentions or nay votes. I will ask that you state your name and jurisdiction as you express your intent to abstain or vote nay. The rest, your silence, is taken as affirmation in favor of the motion on the floor. And also a reminder that your electronic board meeting packet, which was sent in advance, please use that to follow along with the discussion items for today's meeting. And that is available in that email that was sent reminding you of today's meeting, and of course, as always, on the COG website. And if you have any technical issues or concerns during the meeting, please send an email to Pat Warren or populate it in the chat, and we'll be sure to deal with it. All right, Ms. Pandek, I think we're ready for the roll.
Yes, sir. If I might start, please, with the District of Columbia. I have Ms. Perry. Is there anyone else from the district? From the state of Maryland, I have Mr. Adams, Mr. Collins, Mr. O'Connor, Ms. Schaefer, Mr. Harris, Mr. Byrd, Mr. Moe, Mr. Hucker, Ms. Navarro, Mr. Harrison, Ms. Newton, and Ms. Stewart. Is there anybody else from the state of Maryland? From the Commonwealth of Virginia, I have Mr. Wilson, Mr. Dorsey, Mr. Steele, Ms. Gross, Mr. Lusk, Mr. Tartar, Ms. Briskman, Ms. Randall, Mr. Wolf, Mr. Sendejas, Ms. Wheeler, and Ms. Bailey. Is there anyone else from the Commonwealth? Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pendek, and thank you all for being with us today.
Mr.
Before we
Chairman,
get,
if I could just interrupt you, I apologize. I see Mr. Jordan has just joined us, so I wanted to acknowledge him.
thank you. All right, so before we move on with our substantive agenda items, a brief few items for the chairman's report this month. So last month, as you'll recall, the board approved a resolution expressing support for an extension for the 2020 census operations to ensure that there can be a complete and accurate count, recognizing how important this is for all of our jurisdictions. The Council of Governments continues to push forward with all of its census efforts, which included recently releasing a public service announcement with voices from leaders across the region, including several of our board members, emphasizing the need for residents to participate in completing the 2020 census. So thanks to all of those who have participated and for all of the work that you've been doing during this year, difficult as it has been to ensure robust outreach for a complete count. So I believe we may have the video queued up and available. Is that right, Mr. Bean?
Unfortunately, no.
That's okay.
We
That's
will
all right.
drop the link in the chat box in a minute.
We'll drop the link in the chat box and you can look at it during your own time. I'm also very excited to announce that the Council of Governments and the Transportation Planning Board, the TPB, will be co-hosting a virtual town hall series that will begin this month. You've got an email notice of this and go and extend through January of 2021, called Leaning into 2021, More Equitable and More Resilient. This is an exciting learning series where we're going to have some great speakers led off by a couple of University of North Carolina professors who we think will very much stimulate your activism and your actions as local elected officials over the next year. So email notice has been sent for the first of these sessions, which will be Friday, September the 18th at 12 noon. And you can also find more information on the speakers and the subject in your board packet. I'm also thrilled to announce that the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance, NAVAHA, is honoring COG at its 2020 Regional Housing Leaders Award Ceremony next week for its work, for our work on the Regional Housing Initiative and for unanimously approving regional housing targets for 2030. So that work has been widely viewed by people outside of our COG world as being incredibly important to meeting our affordable housing challenges. And it's a thrill that that work was recognized by NAVAHA, and we're honored to receive the award. I'd now like to turn it over to our Executive Director, Chuck Bean, to give us updates via his Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. And the next slide has the is about the 2020 census, is the video that Mr. Dorsey referenced. And we'll put in a link to COG's Twitter feed in case you would like to retweet this video. We're grateful to the 10 elected officials who participated in this video. I want to express our appreciation to our Regional Public Information Officers Committee. They've been quite busy. Common messages on COVID, on reopening, now common messages on census, and I would imagine coming into the next couple of weeks, common message on how to vote in the DMV. So next. As Maryland has proceeded into phase 3 and Montgomery and Prince George's are not going into phase 3, we've done our best to summarize the reopening guidelines, where the district is at, where Northern Virginia is at, where Maryland is at, This can be found on, click the link, please. This can be found on our webpage. And Jenny, if you could click the link, comes up with the address. Yeah, there you go. And that's the link. When you get it, it'll look like this page. And that first bullet is a hyperlink, regional coordination update, reopening guidelines. Where the jurisdictions are at is summarized in a 9-page document replete with hyperlinks if you're curious about what your neighboring jurisdictions are doing. So the next, please. You'll be seeing more integrated planning from COG. What we mean by that is to address some of our biggest regional challenges. We need not just a multidisciplinary approach, but a cross-disciplinary approach that is more integrated. And if that sounds like a lot of planner jargon, let me try to give a couple of examples. It was just 2.5 years ago when TPB came to the COG board with Visualize 2045, and out of Visualize 2045, of the 7 aspirational initiatives, there's a call for greater focus on land use consideration. So Jenny, if you could click. And specifically within land use consideration was bring housing closer to jobs. And that put that squarely in the COG board's court. And click. And of course, the work throughout 2019 to work on the regional housing targets was informed by the housing and planning directors. So Jenny, click and click. So that kind of cross-disciplinary approach where transportation is intricately linked to land use and housing, we need to apply if we're going to achieve ambitious greenhouse gas emissions targets. You're going to get a briefing on that at the end of today's board meeting. So more integrated planning. And what do we mean by that? To make the biggest difference in these targets, click. There's basically 3 sectors, the energy sector, the built environment, what government can regulate, what the private sector needs to deliver, and then in road transportation. If we're going to make big steps forward, for example, in electric vehicle infrastructure, we're going to need more coordinated planning across transportation and our environmental programs. So Jenny, next slide. So a more integrated approach to metropolitan planning. This is epitomized by number 1, more consultation between the COG board and the TPB. And we've done that this year with the COG board executive committee, transportation planning board consultation. And in this virtual town hall series, leaning in, more resilient, more equitable, co-sponsored by COG and TPB. Also in the last year, I created the position Deputy Executive Director for Metropolitan Planning, occupied by Kanti Srikanth, so that we can get the muscle that we have within the Metropolitan Planning Organization spread throughout other disciplines. And next, when we think about work on integrated approach to working on greenhouse gas reductions, we can look back to work that we did just a couple of years ago. And we'll put a link in here. We'll put a link in the chat box to work that consulting firm ICF did for us on energy, built environment, and transportation. And if we're going to pursue these ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets, we're going to need to be working across disciplines, but we have a good base to begin on. So that's what I wanted to update the board on, and look for more of this integrated planning. But before I turn it back to you, Mr. Darcy, I'd like to turn the floor over to our IT director, Lionel Bernard. It's been 6 months since our 125 staff have moved to maximum telework posture, and I've asked him just to provide about 3 updates on how that is going. So Lionel, the floor is yours.
Mr. Bean, I don't think we have Lionel.
I'm sorry, I have my thing on mute.
Great.
Apologies. Thanks, Chuck. Well, again, my name is Lionel Bernard. I'm the Director of IT here at Cog. And Chuck is absolutely right. A few months ago, we were suddenly given the mandate to have all of our staff telework, and that has imposed some challenges on our IT staff. But I want to discuss briefly some of the measures that we put in place to improve the security of teleworking, as well as the efficiency of teleworking. Next slide, please. So the first project that we undertook when the COVID work from home mandate was imposed is to transition from a remote desktop telework platform to a Citrix telework platform. And the driving factor for this transition was to ensure the reliability and security of our teleworking. As you may or may not know, Citrix offers two-factor security authentication. What this implies is that whenever our staff is accessing our telework platform, before they could just log in with their credentials, now they're required to provide a 6-digit security code that's generated automatically, and that goes away. And it's a one-time use password. We launched this platform in May of 2020, and we're very, very pleased to say that this has definitely strengthened our security, the security of our telework platform. Next slide. The second initiative that we undertook to support teleworking or to improve our teleworking capabilities is to transition our staff from desktops to laptops. We currently have about 42% of our staff using laptops, and our goal is that by within the next few months, we're going to gradually increase that number to about 75%. And there are several reasons for that. One is that it's going to improve the mobility. So we've got staff coming into the office as well as working from home. So we needed them to have the ability to bring their laptops into the office as well as take it home. We also discovered that in the last few months, the building that Cog is housed in is susceptible to power outages, and this has caused some data loss for some staff members. So transitioning to laptops as well as virtualizing some of their desktop is not only going to allow us to resolve the issue of power outages, shutting down desktops within the office, but it's also going to give us a lower cost of ownership for desktops by transitioning to a virtual desktop platform. And one last thing is that we noticed that some of our staff are using dual devices, in that some staff members, we have laptops at home as well as desktops in the office. So this process of migrating to one single primary telework device is also going to reduce our overhead in terms of equipment to support. The last and final initiative that we undertook to improve our telework capabilities is transition from a desk phone to an app-based phone. As you might know, as our staff move to transition to a home environment as a workspace, they left their desktop phones behind. So the issue became, staff using their private phone lines to make business calls related to Cog. So to alleviate this problem, we're in the process of piloting a Microsoft Teams-based phone system to allow our staff members to receive calls directly to their desktop, as well as to make calls directly from their desktop or laptop, no matter where they are. And one of the other driving factors to this migration is that it's going to reduce the cost of our phone system by 75% overall within the next year. We're going to start piloting this app-based phone platform around October timeframe. But these are 3 initiatives that we've undertaken, or we're in the process of undertaking, that will significantly, or has already significantly improved staff's ability to telework. Next slide, please. Now, besides improving our telework capabilities, one of the things that we've been focused on is improving our cybersecurity resiliency. And back in November last year, we implemented a security awareness training program here at Cog, the first of its kind. In coordination with that effort, which is done on a monthly basis, an annual basis, we've also implemented a monthly phishing attack simulation program here at Cog. As you all know, ransomware primarily comes in via emails. That's the main vehicle attackers use to deliver a ransomware malware to your desktop. So the weakest point in any security system is the users. So one of the things that we're doing here on a monthly basis at COG is we're engaging in a phishing attack simulation. And what it entails is we're sending emails to all of our staff members. These are fake, bogus emails, but the staff don't know it. They look very realistic. In some cases, they're asking for confidential information. They have attachments to them, or they may have a link in them. And the system that we're using tracks whether or not the software was the email was open, whether it was clicked, or whether the user opened an attachment to this email. And all of this information allow us to build resiliency amongst our staff in terms of their ability to identify phishing email that may be quite damaging in some cases. So one of the things that we've also done is we've given staff the ability to report a phishing email. We put a button right within their Outlook. They click on that button and they're able to report it. So over the past 8 months since we've been running the simulation, several things have happened that we've noticed that have improved our cybersecurity posture. The first is that most staff is reporting email now. When we started the simulation back in December, no one was reporting phishing emails. Now we've got 28% on average reporting a phishing email coming in every month. We've got less staff clicking on the links in the email, as well as less staff opening the attachment. Again, the links and attachments are primary delivery vehicles for malware and ransomware to any organization. The software we're also using has indicated that our security posture in terms of phishing, a phishing attack has gone lower from 27% when we did a baseline back in November to currently 9%. The software has also indicated that the average nonprofit of similar size to COG has a 39% on average exposure to a phishing attack, meaning that they have a pretty large phishing attack exposure. So in summary, these are some of the things that we've done to improve our telework capabilities, as well as our security posture at COG. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Bernard. Mr. Bean, does that conclude your report?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. And very much appreciate that summary of all that we're doing to facilitate telework and keep COG secure in the process. And it looks like find some significant cost savings. This pandemic has brought both challenges and opportunities. And it's good to see that at least here, COG is leaning into doing the best it can. So we'll move on with our next agenda item, which is any proposals for amendments to today's agenda. So if you have a proposed amendment, please say so now. And hearing none, the agenda as submitted is approved, and we will follow it and continue on with agenda item number 5, which is approval of the minutes from our August 12th, 2020 COG board meeting.
Penny Gross moves approval.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. Is there a second?
Second, Supervisor Bailey.
Supervisor Bailey, thank you for the second. Now I'll ask if there are any abstentions or nay votes.
Yeah,
any abstentions or nay votes.
I'll abstain. This is David Tarter, Falls Church. I was not present.
Okay, Mayor Tarter, any other abstentions or nay votes?
Nancy Nalato abstains, so I wasn't present.
Thank you.
Neil Harris, I'll abstain for the same reason.
Thank you. Did we catch all of those? All right, so with those 3 abstentions, the motion passes. We'll now move on with our next agenda item, number 6, consideration of our consent agenda. I'll just briefly highlight what these items are. We have in turn resolutions R32, 33, 34, and 35, all for the calendar year 2020. The first is a resolution authorizing COG to receive a grant and then to procure and enter into a contract to complete a homeless services regional equity analysis. The next, resolution endorsing the 2019 annual report on crime and crime control. Then a resolution authorizing COG to procure and enter into a contract for source water protection consulting services. And the last, a resolution authorizing COG to procure and enter into a contract to analyze remotely sensed land cover data, looking at the tree canopy in the District of Columbia. Is there a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda?
This is Penny Gross. I move approval.
Thank you. Moved by Ms. Gross.
Nancy
I have a
Nalato,
second.
I second.
Thank you for the
Mancinello
second.
seconds it.
We'll now see if there are any abstentions or nay votes for the consent agenda. Hearing none, the consent agenda passes. Our next agenda, item number 7, will ultimately lead to hopefully a motion to approve the FY21 and the 5-year capital expenditure plan and budget. Leading this item will be our CFO, Julie Mussig, and our Secretary Treasurer, Kate Stewart, who will brief the COG board on the 5-year capital expenditure plan and budget. Afterwards, we will accept a motion for Resolution R36 2020 to approve said plans. So I'll now turn it over to Mayor Stewart to kick off this item.
Great, thank you so much. The staff prepared and the Budget and Finance Committee has reviewed the FY21 and the 5-year capital budget plan, and we recommend approval by the board after we hear from our Chief Financial Officer. I will turn it over to her now to present.
Thank you. Good afternoon. COG presents a 5-year capital plan annually to the Budget and Finance Committee and Board of Directors for approval of current year capital expenditures and a preview of expected expenditures for the next 4 years. COG has a board capital expenditure reserve that is used for the purchase of long-term assets. It is replenished over time through the allocation of depreciation expense to COG's various funding sources. The FY21 through FY25 capital plan proposes expenditures in FY21 of $375,500 and a total of $4.1 million in expenditures over the next 5 years. $3.4 million of that $4.1 million are related to the office remodel. On page 4 of the presentation, just back up 2 pages, of the plan details the expenditures for FY21 in the amount of $375,500. Expenses are for IT equipment, leasehold improvements, and furniture, which include, Lionel briefed you on a number of these initiatives, and I'm just giving you the details on some of the costs associated with them. The first item is $100,000 for new storage equipment. We have some storage equipment that is reaching obsolescence by the end of this calendar year. This may or may not be necessary to replace depending on where we are in our cloud upgrades at that point. So this is a cautionary budgeted item because they are reaching obsolescence. There's $80,000 budgeted for a laptop refresh and for the phone system related to the Teams phones if the pilot is successful. $20,000 related to significantly increase the speed and capacity of the Wi-Fi network used by staff on the 3rd floor. This project was actually approved in the FY20 capital budget, but was delayed until fiscal year 21. We have $45,000 for the phase 2 and 3 of the new Telework platform and $25,000 for the first phase of a new document management system that will be implemented over the next 2 years. $50,000 related to space planning and potential COVID compliant issues for the office space, and $25,500 for new COVID compliant furniture for the open workspace in Homeland Security and Public Safety. Pages 5 and 6 of the plan show the projected 5-year capital expenditure plan. Page 7 of the plan provides a summary and a forecast of the balance in the capital expenditure reserve as of June 30, 2021, which is estimated at $5 million. Approval of the plan authorizes expenditures of $375,500 in fiscal 2021 for the assets as described above. The expenses noted for FY22 and FY22 through FY 2025 are presented for planning purposes only. These expenditures will be reviewed, modified, and presented to the Budget and Finance Committee and Board of Directors in subsequent fiscal years for final approval. Are there any questions before I turn it back to Mayor Stewart?
Any questions for Ms. Mussig?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, this is Chair Randall. I have a question.
Please, Chair Randall.
So first of all, I support all these changes. You all have been working in a building that's been giving you challenges for a very long time, and it's so important to get that right. My question is are the changes that you all are planning to do, assuming that everyone will be back in the office and you're going to not have any more teleworking after when we get past COVID? We're assuming that all the Cog staff is back in the building at that time?
The assumption would be that everybody would be working in the office at least some of the time. So I don't know that we've been able to, much like a lot of people on this call, firmly establish what everybody's schedules will be going forward and when that might be. But the assumption is that we'll at some point resume using the office as we have in the past, but maybe with some changes, which is why we're putting off any major office renovations until at least FY22-23. I think there's a lot of best practices out there we want to be able to look at before we move ahead and spend money.
That makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. And again, I support it. You all have been working with in kind of a tough living environment in the building for a long time. So thank you for the answer.
Okay. Seeing no other questions at this time, we'll turn it back over to Secretary Treasurer Stewart.
Thank you so much. So we have a resolution before us, Resolution R36-2020. And I'd like to make a motion for this resolution and ask our board to approve it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stewart. So we do have a motion to adopt Resolution R36-2020, which includes the 5-year capital expenditure plan and the upcoming fiscal year 2021 capital expenditure budget. Is there a second?
Seconded by Chair Randall.
Seconded by Chair Randall. Let's see if there are any other comments or questions from members of the board. I will first look to see in the chat if we have any questions, and I don't see any as of yet. So I'll see if we have any live questions. We'll start first with any questions from board members from Maryland.
Secretary and Mayor Stewart, I just wanted to add at the time my thanks to staff. This is, as we've all noted, this is a very difficult time looking at plans moving forward, and I just want to extend my thanks to the staff as they've done this.
Indeed. Any other questions, comments from members from Maryland? How about the Commonwealth of Virginia?
Mr. Dorsey, I just want to, this is Supervisor Bailey, just want to thank the staff for their forward thinking and physical accountability. We really appreciate it.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Ms. Bailey. As you can see from this plan, the COG board is very mindful that we are under great uncertainty in the years ahead, and it has modified its plans accordingly and presented, at least from my opinion, not only a very responsible capital expenditure plan, but one that has some pretty key values undergirding it in addition to fiscal responsibility, and that is making sure we are able to recruit and retain a workforce that has the flexibility that is required not only in today's general environment, but of course in a post-pandemic world. Any other questions or comments from members from the Commonwealth of Virginia? How about the District of Columbia?
District of Columbia, just want to really express my thanks for the hard work put into this. I don't think it's lost on any of us that kind of going forward, we're going to have to evaluate the possibility of more widespread telework and reducing our office space, our footprint. But as the Cog staff said in response to the question earlier, right now we don't know what's ahead. So I think given where we are, that this is a great work, and I look forward to supporting it.
Thank you, Vice Chair White. Any other questions, comments from the District of Columbia? Okay, we'll now move to a vote for Resolution R36-2020. I'll seek to find any abstentions or nay votes. Hearing none, that constitutes approval for Resolution R36-2020. Our next agenda item is number 8. We'll look at the region's efforts toward contact tracing, and we'll get a comprehensive update that I know is very much on the top of people's minds as they consider how our region continues to respond to the COVID pandemic. So we will be briefed on the benefits of having a successful contact tracing program and really home in on COG's role in facilitating collaboration among our respective jurisdictions and how we as elected officials can provide support for these efforts. We'll hear first from the Virginia Department of Health, Northern Virginia epidemiologist Denise Sockwell, and then we will hear from COG Principal Health Planner Jennifer Sheeter. So I'll turn it first over to Denise Sockwell, and then we'll hear from Ms. Sheeter.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with you about contact tracing for COVID-19. Public health officials throughout the NCR are doing a lot of work, and I'm happy to share it with you. At the beginning of the year, when I spoke with you, prior to our first cases of COVID-19 hitting the region, I couldn't have imagined where we would be right now. COVID-19 is a disease that's presented us with many challenges. The fact that we have no vaccine to prevent the disease or medication that we can easily provide to someone to treat and also prevent the time period where they're infectious leads us to many issues. We are left with our most basic means of disease prevention and control strategies: case investigation and contact tracing using isolation and quarantine respectively, and the education that's provided to individuals. That process is what I've been asked to discuss with you today. You've heard it often. This is an evolving situation and we are still learning. Preventing people from contracting this illness is our best bet, which is why we need to have very strong case investigation and contact tracing programs. We are counting on people to take the appropriate steps to protect themselves and others. Although there are some slight differences in how we're conducting business across the NCR, for example, we're using different software programs to help us monitor people under isolation and quarantine. All of our health departments are basically doing the same thing. I'll take a few minutes to talk about our process of case investigation and contact tracing, why it's so important, and some of the challenges that we face. I can understand how the terminology, the multiple dates that we discuss, and the change in some of our public health recommendations over time can be confusing to the public. Next slide. That's why today I'd like to start with just some key definitions that are pertinent for the control of COVID-19. The first is close contact. We define that as any individual within 6 feet of an infected person for at least 15 minutes. The incubation period is that period of time between when a person is exposed and their onset of symptoms. For COVID-19, that incubation period is 2 to 14 days. During the incubation period, we are watching someone basically to see if they develop symptoms. The infectious period is that time period when a person can spread the disease from one person to another. During COVID-19, it is 2 days prior to symptom onset, so before someone may even have a clue that they are ill, they are capable of spreading this disease to others. And that goes until at least 10 days after symptom onset. We've learned that with COVID-19, we have a large percentage of individuals that may not develop symptoms at all. And for those individuals, we look at their infectious period as beginning with their test date. So 2 days prior to their test date until 10 days afterwards. And you'll see that the infectious period coincides with the incubation period and their period of isolation, which is that separation of the infected person from others while they're capable of spreading the disease. And with COVID-19, we basically look at that individual being healthy, without taking fever-reducing medications and an improvement of their symptoms, and at least 10 days since the onset of their symptoms. And that is because CDC studies have shown that an individual can transmit this infection for at least 9 days after onset of symptoms. And again, for someone that was asymptomatic, we look at that 10 days from the test date. The quarantine period, keeping someone who has been exposed away from others during that incubation period, is 14 days after the last exposure for COVID-19. And then source control, which I just had to add, is the use of cloth face coverings to cover a person's nose and mouth to prevent the release of respiratory secretions when they're talking, sneezing, coughing, singing, whatever the case may be. And with COVID-19, the reason that this is recommended for everyone is because we now know that there's that potential of someone who has no symptoms at all spreading this disease, and also someone is capable of spreading it 2 days prior to their onset of symptoms or when they are pre-symptomatic. So I just want to mention those things because we realize that with COVID-19, all of the definitions can be very confusing to the general public. We talk about 2 days, 14 days, 10 days. And now, if you could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about case investigation and contact tracing because they are tied together. I'm not going to go through every step on this workflow, but I want you to have this to look at and certainly ask questions later if you would like. We start with interviewing people who have the disease. This means that in general, they have to have had symptoms, go to a doctor or someplace to be tested, then those lab results have to be reported to the health department. There are several fail points in that process, and we try to reduce those as much as possible. When we do get in touch with the person, not only do we provide control recommendations to reduce the spread of the disease from that person to others and discuss isolation, sometimes needing to identify a location where this can be done, but we also identify people who have been in close contact with the ill person. Sometimes that involves identifying a workplace or other area where people have gathered. We also identify outbreaks by asking if others at the work site or other gathering places are known to be ill. Next slide. Contact tracing begins with a case investigation, identifying those people who are close contacts and therefore potentially exposed. By gathering the names and the contact information of those individuals, we contact them to let them know of their potential exposure. At that point, we ask them to quarantine for the remainder of their incubation period. We realize that this can be very difficult. If the infected person lives in the same household, the quarantine period starts when the infected person's isolation period ends. For the majority of individuals, we ask them not to go to work or engage in other activities outside of the household where they could potentially spread this disease to others. Part of the reason is because if a person becomes infectious or capable of spreading the disease, it can be 2 days prior to their symptom onset or when they don't even have symptoms at all. Potentially during isolation and definitely during quarantine, people are monitored daily, sometimes with phone calls or through email. We ask people to be tested if they've been exposed at least 5 to 7 days after that last exposure so that we can identify the illness early and again, prevent that spread to other people. However, if the person tests negative, they must still finish their quarantine period. This can be very confusing to individuals, but a negative test does not allow someone to shorten their quarantine period. There's another measure that we look at, and that's the percentage of cases who were identified because they were already in quarantine. That means we were already monitoring this person and we were aware of them. That is one of the things that can stop the future spread of this infection. It sounds like a simple process, but there are many complications. We have staff that work to provide wraparound or support services for people who are unable or not prepared to suddenly remain in their homes during isolation or quarantine. When results are relayed, that causes another problem for us in the follow-up. Over the past several months, we've all hired and trained additional staff to conduct disease investigation and contact tracing. In Northern Virginia alone, we've hired hundreds of additional staff members. In some situations, we've hired more new staff than were previously employed by the health department. But it's necessary because these are very time-consuming, person-intensive activities that must be done daily because cases are reported to us each day. We also have to be prepared for outbreaks and surges. There are several challenges involving the disease itself, as well as our public health follow-up. Regarding the disease, it's a respiratory virus that spreads relatively easily. It has a short incubation period. Sometimes by the time we've gotten in touch with someone, there could be secondary cases or tertiary cases. And individuals who are infected can spread the virus before they have symptoms and even if they have no symptoms at all. Regarding public health follow-up, we have to get in touch with people, both the cases and the contacts, which means they have to answer the phone when public health is calling. We elicit information from cases about their contacts, and people are sometimes very wary of this process because we do ask for personal information. By law, we must keep an individual's information confidential. One reason for confidentiality laws is to encourage people to be cooperative. In addition, people may not even know the names or contact individuals or contact information for people who have been close contacts. We're also relying on people to be compliant with isolation and quarantine, both individuals being compliant and also workplaces understanding that periods of isolation and quarantine will be occurring throughout this pandemic. Not everyone is able to isolate, and it can be very disruptive to a person's life. All of a sudden receiving a phone call that for the next up to 14 days, you are supposed to remain in your house. There is also some distrust of the government as we are collecting this information, and there are certainly cross-jurisdictional issues as well as testing resource issues. Virginia is using a program called COVID-Wise to help reduce some of these issues. It's an app available for Android and Apple platforms, and it functions by having individuals download and activate the app before becoming ill or being around anyone with the illness. Anonymous keys are shared via Bluetooth, and if a person later becomes infected, they activate the app with a PIN from the health department, and then that system will notify people who have been in close contact for the prior 10 to 14 days. The person receiving the alert is a close contact, and then they have to quarantine for 14 days. It's critical to support the work of local health departments and encourage cooperation wherever possible. The entire process that I've described relies on people cooperating with their local health department and the recommendations. We realize it's difficult for individuals as well as businesses. I've mentioned that there are some cross-jurisdictional issues, and now I'll turn it over to Jenny Sheeter to talk about how she is helping us overcome some of those. Jenny?
Great. Thank you, Denise. Again, I'm Jenny Sheeter. I'm the Principal Health Planner here at the Council of Governments, and I'm happy to share with you our regional contact tracing work. Back in early June, the state epidemiologists from DC, Maryland, and Virginia were brought together to identify regional challenges with contact tracing. Their top priority was to standardize a way to transfer contact tracing data across the region. For example, if a Virginia resident had adequate exposure to a case at their work in DC, DC would transfer this individual's information to Virginia to begin that contact tracing process. Contacts need to be transferred to the jurisdiction of where they reside to ensure they're aware of the laws, regulations, and guidelines of their home state. While this exchange currently happens, there was a need to better structure the process of transferring this health protected information. So since that original meeting back in June, COG has convened a group of 20 to 30 health department representatives on a weekly basis to develop a secure and daily way to transfer contacts across the region. Luckily, the Association of Public Health Laboratories, APHL, and CDC are allowing DC, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia to transfer contact tracing data on their AIMS platform. This is a trusted platform already being used by states to share electronic laboratory reporting data. But not only are we hammering out this technical process, we are detailing that protocol for sharing. So when to share, how to share, and even a standard template for sharing. And we're also working through various scenarios. For example, who would monitor a DC resident who is currently staying on a college campus in Maryland? So the states did discuss this scenario and came to an agreement that the jurisdiction of where that contact currently resides would be responsible for monitoring, in that the jurisdiction of where they lay their head at night. It is scenarios like this we continue to work through over our weekly meetings. At this point, we are currently in the testing phase of the AIMS platform, and APHL is actively working with states to speed up this testing phase. They are scheduling interstate meetings to ensure this successful transfer. After the testing phase, both the states and APHL are looking to promote this practice nationally. At this point, COG would step back and APHL would continue to monitor the platform. For example, they would ensure files don't sit on the platform over 24 hours before being retrieved, and APHL would continue to provide that direct technical assistance to states as they come on board. So with that, I want to thank you again for the opportunity for allowing myself and Denise to speak with you on contact tracing, and we are happy to take questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Ms. Sheeter and Ms. Sockwell, for your extensive presentation on contact tracing. So, colleagues, first of all, let's see if we have any questions from board members. We don't have any in the chat, so we'll look first to see if we have any from members from the Commonwealth, the state of Maryland. Moving next to the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I had a question, Chair.
Sure, is that Ms. Briskman?
It is Julie Briskman, Loudoun County. Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting. As you're probably aware, Virginia has COVID-WISE, which kind of the first step and what might kick off this entire process. Is there any discussion about other states that may or may not have a similar app and how those apps might talk to each other? Because, in our area, it might not make sense to have it only for one state, is what I'm thinking.
Yes, so there have been discussions with DC and Maryland, and they have each been looking at using a similar electronic solution, but I believe it's a different system than what we are using in Virginia. We're hoping that all of these systems will be able to talk to each other. And our Virginia system does allow people who live certainly outside of the Commonwealth to download the app and use it, so that if someone is working in Northern Virginia, they are welcome to download the app and would be notified if they had been in close contact with someone who later became a case.
Okay, I see. And then I guess there's a reason why, I guess it's privacy. You can't know how many, like say in your county, have downloaded the app? I guess we know statewide how many people have downloaded the app, but can you still determine the efficacy of these apps if you don't know how many people in your jurisdiction are using it?
In order for the app to work appropriately, we do need to have many people who have downloaded this app prior to becoming cases and prior to becoming exposed. I am not sure how they release information as far as the number of people within each jurisdiction that have downloaded the app. I'm not sure how they're really able to do that. But that is certainly one of our concerns with the effectiveness of this app. We're hoping that in certain populations, at least, if the uptake is much higher, it can be very effective. So certainly college campuses or areas where we would have large numbers of people that are interacting on a regular basis, if we can encourage those people to download and use the app, then that will be beneficial.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from members of the Commonwealth of Virginia?
I have a question, Chairman Dorsey.
All right.
Sure.
Randall.
So there has been a lot of discussion about, and this is for the epidemiologist, whether or not somebody can contract COVID twice. As we talk about tracing, are you keeping, or is there any kind of tracing of a person that's had COVID already? And does that, how does that, I mean, like, how long after they are testing negative, we tracing them, or where have contracted COVID, or how does that?
Yes.
Tracing.
So currently, we are using a definition that is 90 days. So basically 3 months.
Yeah.
If a person has had COVID-19 within 3 months, then we do not believe at this point that they are reinfected. So even if they test positive repeatedly during that time, and some of the tests for COVID-19 are extremely sensitive, and they can pick up viral fragments for days, weeks, and even months after a person has actually had the infection. So we look at that 90-day period. If it is after that 90-day period, then we start to consider the possibility of reinfection, and we will look at that individual situation more closely. If someone has had COVID-19 and they are exposed to someone else, if they are within that 90-day period, then they do not have to go into quarantine again.
So then, I
Randall?
missed some of that answer because there was some breaking up, but I think I caught most of it. So is the assumption, from what I could hear you saying, maybe I missed some of it, is the assumption based on that answer is that a person can be infected with COVID twice, but the time in between the a positive would be 90 days? Is that what I heard you say?
I'm just going to try to move us along, Chair Randall. So I think what we heard was within 90 days, because of the sensitivity of the tests, the virus can be picked up even though it's from the known infection. After a 90-day period, they would consider any positivity a reinfection and would be looked at as a specific case.
And traced as a new case.
We're getting nods, so yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. So are there any questions from board members from the District of Columbia? All right, hearing none. If there are any questions that do come up, please use the chat box and we'll be sure to address those offline. Otherwise, thank you so much, Ms. Sockwell and Ms. Sheeter, for the excellent presentation on something that is absolutely essential to getting our region back to some sense of normality. We'll now move on with our next agenda item, which is a report from the Food and Agriculture Regional Member Ad Hoc Committee, or the proposed regional member ad hoc committee. So For those of you who have not been following this conversation, COG has been working with the agricultural community for many years to support how we can keep our local farms and food businesses strong, to support the public health goals and environmental benefits, desired environmental benefits for our communities. And over the last few years specifically, COG has expanded its work with our member jurisdictions, food policy councils, universities, food suppliers, and others who are in the food system supply chain. This is shown to be particularly important as all of our governments currently, along with our school systems and community services partners, have worked to provide healthy food to a growing number of food insecure families that have manifested during the pandemic. So we are pleased to have our Can everyone please remember to mute yourself if you are not speaking? Thank you. We are now pleased to be joined by Jay Staley, who is our COG Chesapeake Bay and Water Resources Policy Committee Chair, and it's John Staley, who has led an effort to more effectively collaborate on food value chain efforts across our region. This presentation today will lead to consideration of a resolution to establish an ad hoc committee to look at food and agriculture from a regional perspective. Mr. Staley. And I think you're muted. So, John?
Let's try that now. How about there? We better? That's a success. We're on day 2 of virtual learning here, so I never know how much bandwidth the hamster has. So far we're doing okay over here in the great city of Fairfax. Well, thank you, Chair Dorsey, for that kind introduction. As you mentioned, I have the privilege of chairing the Chesapeake Bay and Water Resources Committee, and I'm here today to ask for your support for Resolution 37-2020, the resolution endorsing the establishment of a food and agriculture regional member ad hoc committee. And if you're playing bingo on excellent acronyms, the FARM committee, I think, should be one of those squares. You'll find the resolution on page 31 of the board packet. As the chair mentioned, for many years, and in particular over this past year, we at the Chesapeake Bay Committee have been home to an ag task force led by Councilmember Craig Rice and including Supervisor Penny Gross, Vice Chair Libby Garvey, Councilmember Amy Jackson, and myself. And our charge was really to make recommendations on how to implement the finding in the COG's Nationally Unique What Our Region Grows report. We had the privilege of working with staff and interviewed many of your colleagues and over 40 leaders from the district, Maryland, and Virginia to put together a working paper with our findings and develop a funding plan to support the recommendations. And as the chair mentioned, this built over many decades of work with our regional agriculture working group and the regional food systems program, including significant support from the philanthropy community. Our recommendation coming from this effort was to form a regional food and agriculture economy commission. However, as COVID-19 really came to fruition, we affirmed that we needed to do something in this particular approach, and this type of ad hoc committee seemed to fit best with the realities that we're all facing. I want to draw particular attention to note that it's more than just farms and supply chains that are impacted, but many of our residents are facing food insecurity and challenges in accessing the food we all need to stay healthy and thrive. In particular, we have seen disproportionate impacts in communities of color and immigrant communities. So I am pleased to be here today with the support of not only our committee with the Chesapeake Bay and Water Resources Policy Committee, but the Climate, Energy, Environmental Policy Committee and the Region Forward Coalition to ask for your endorsement for this next step, this FARM committee, which will exist for a period of year with any necessary extensions approved by the COG board. Let's talk a bit about what the committee will be charged with. It's got 4 major policy charges. 1, making policy recommendations to support a more resilient, connected food and farm economy in the region. 2, recommending on how to provide longer-term direction and collaboration to a regional food and agriculture committee. 3rd, furthering the goals identified in the What the Region Grows report. And 4th, assisting COG in continuing its COVID-19 regional food security programming. We've also attached draft bylaws for your information that lay out the mission of the farm and the types of members. These will be finalized at the committee. However, the aim is to bring in expertise of stakeholders working on issues across the jurisdictions to come together to find solutions. And although there are some details to work out regarding the meeting frequency, I want to echo the cross-disciplinary integrated approach that was highlighted at the top of this conversation by Mr. Bean. This is really an opportunity to leverage that thinking to solve this particular program and problems that this area identified. I'm also pleased to share that provided the COG board chair and committee is supportive, that Councilmember Mary Che, who I believe is on the line, and I'll turn to her momentarily, has agreed to chair this committee with Councilmember Craig Rice and myself serving as the vice chairs. And we really hope that the members of our Ag Task Force I mentioned earlier will continue on members of the Farm Committee if they can. And we're looking forward to identifying other colleagues working on issues of food and agricultural across the region to join us in this critical initiative. This is an opportunity to connect jurisdiction with those that have significant amounts of land, such as Frederick and Loudoun and other areas, to our more urban and suburban communities, which have their own food and agricultural assets and needs. I'll highlight our council meeting yesterday in the city of Fairfax. We happily approved the second authorization of the keeping of chickens in the city of Fairfax. And so this is our second approval there, but it highlights the need to connect back to what we all do every day. I'm about to open it up to Councilmember Che and Rice if they would like to make any comments, but I just want to close with a note that we're excited to move forward in this initiative. All of us share a desire to take action and come in this next year with some positive results on how we can take this next step forward. So with that, I'll pause and see if Councilmember Che or Rice has a comment to add.
Thank you, Mr. Staley. Ms. Che, Mr. Rice?
Yes, thank you very much. I enthusiastically support creating this ad hoc committee. And as everybody should realize now that this regional focus on food issues couldn't be more timely or more vital. When I came to the council on the District of Columbia, I didn't have it as food issues as my main focus because it turns out that food issues really are, the quiet crisis among many communities. And when I toured schools and when I traveled around the district, I realized how rampant food insecurity was and how it had to be reckoned with new policies and new approaches. And so there are many programs that we created here in the District of Columbia. And then, to top it all off, I created this Food Policy Council to coordinate our efforts. And it made me realize the interconnectedness of all of our food issues. And that's why I think this ad hoc committee from COG is going to really advance us so much further, because we need to look at and bring together urban, suburban, rural jurisdictions with the different roles that people are playing in the food system to make us even more effective. And so we've seen now some of the sort of quiet crises of the past become a more urgent, visible crisis with COVID-19 and the disparate effects that poor nutrition and lack of access to good food has had on many communities, and just the general problem of food insecurity because of the economic effects of the virus. So I look forward to the committee getting up and running so that we can begin this important work. And I want to encourage everyone to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Che. Any comments from Mr. Rice? All right, hearing none, I would very much like to thank you, John and Mary, for those comments and for both being willing to lead on this and to provide direction and leadership for the committee in the year ahead. We will consider appointments to all members of the committee at next month's board meeting. Before we get into any questions or comments, I'd like to see if there's a motion on the floor for adopting Resolution R37 2020, endorsing the establishment of the Farm, Food and Agriculture Regional Member Committee.
This is Penny Gross. I would be happy to make that motion.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. Is there a second?
This is Tim. I'd like to second.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. We appreciate the second. We'll now see if there are any questions. Seeing none in the chat box, I'd now like to look for members from board members from Maryland.
Hi, this is Nancy Navarro from Montgomery County. I just want to applaud this effort. I think as Councilmember Mary Chey pointed out, I myself have had a renewed awareness and also real commitment to making sure that we are leveraging whatever resources we have. And I think in Montgomery County in particular, as we have an ag reserve, really looking at how can we best leverage those types of resources in the face of a pandemic such as the one we're facing right now, and recognizing that this issue of food insecurity is something that is not just real, but can be compounded during times of crises. And so I look forward to the work of this group in helping us understand how we could continue to leverage and also protect those types of resources that then we can deploy during possible times of food shortages in general in our jurisdictions. Thank you.
Anyone else from Maryland looking to be recognized? We'll move next to Virginia board members.
Chairman, this is Penny Gross.
Ms. Gross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was a member of I am a member of the task force. And I, quite frankly, joined the task force because I was skeptical at the time about whether this was really something that COG should get involved in. But I thought, okay, I will see what we might find out. We were helped mightily by COVID-19, quite frankly. However, I look at this, we started this some time ago, well before COVID-19. Craig Rice was very enthusiastic about this. Other members of the task force were very enthusiastic about this. And I think that we were very prescient, really, in establishing a task force before the crisis came. We didn't know this crisis was going to hit, but it has really ramped up our efforts. The one thing that I don't know that was actually mentioned, and it is something that we're going to have to wrangle with at COG, should this motion pass, is the funding for the work that an ad hoc committee would do, because it is not automatically part of COG's budget, and the jurisdictions are going to have to step up and do their part. So that's just a caution. But I was happy to make the motion, and I'm really delighted to see how this is being embraced by jurisdictions in the COG region.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. Any other comments from Virginia board members? I'll take this opportunity to really thank Ms. Gross for sharing that vulnerability of being initially skeptical. I would count myself among those as well, not because this is not an incredibly important topic, but I had myopically thought about issues of food insecurity and efficiencies in the food supply chain as largely being locally controlled and impacted and responsive to the needs of people who are in your neighborhoods. But recognizing certainly the pandemic helped, that food insecurity and distribution efficiency and viability of businesses are all systemic issues which are probably well addressed with a coordinated regional effort. So given that it's a new area of work, and given that we have to figure out the scale of the problem and our capacity to address it, formation of this ad hoc committee is a great way to get that work started, and I appreciate the willing and talented members who want to lead it. Any questions or comments from District of Columbia board members?
Yes, this is Councilmember Robert White. I do want to thank the committee for their work, and I'm glad others expressed their skepticism first, so that I didn't have to say it. But I think that as others have pointed out, that the pandemic has put such a strong focus on food insecurity, and obviously that is tied directly to agriculture. And like almost every other issue, none of this is unique to any of our jurisdictions. When one jurisdiction is struggling with something, most likely all of us are. I was heading to a meeting yesterday and just saw the length of a food line outside. It broke my heart and really made me think about how much work we have to do to plug this gap of food insecurity, and how much better and more efficient we can be if we work together. The district does not have a whole lot of land to contribute to efforts, but Mary Chey will make sure we do our share. And I'm really glad that Councilmember Chey will be on the committee and leading it in the interim, because she really has taken the lead on these issues from the perspective of the council and the district as a whole. So I'm excited to see the work that you all do and look forward to supporting the effort.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair White. So we'll now move on for consideration of Resolution R37 2020. I'll ask for any abstentions or nay votes. Hearing none, all involved in this effort can take that as unanimous support for this effort to move forward in the year ahead, and we look forward to your work product as often as you would like to share it with the larger board. Our next agenda item is the Regional Crime Report, and we are going to be joined by Police Chiefs Committee Chair David Huckler, who will brief the board on the results of the 2019 annual report on crime and crime control, and how this information can help establish local and regional crime control initiatives. We, of course, recognize at the outset that we're having, other and different conversations about policing in our communities. This is not that. It's a look back at 2019. So while I understand that your thought space may be in other areas, recognize that this item is looking at our outcomes from the previous year. So, Mr. Huckler.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Can you guys hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the 2019 Annual Crime Report. We certainly appreciate the board's support and the work we're doing in the Chief Subcommittee. I also want to just take a moment to thank our Cog Staff Representatives, Mr. Rosano and Mr. Boggs. Without their support, we certainly couldn't do the work we're doing regionally. And then I'm not sure if they're on the call, but my two co-chairs, Assistant Chief Jeff Carroll out of Metropolitan Police Department and Chief Russ Hamill out of the City of Laurel, their efforts are also greatly appreciated as we put together this report and do the work of the Chiefs Committee. As Mr. Dorsey indicated, this is a look back in 2019. It's the annual crime report put on behalf for the Board of Directors. This report pulls crime stats from all the jurisdictions that contribute to COG, including several associate jurisdictions. The report, as you go through it, you'll recognize that there are three different reporting methods that we use to compile all this data. We use the Uniform Crime Report, which is often called the UCR, and then we also use the NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. NIBRS and UCR do coordinate and collaborate with one another. NIBRS is just a more detailed accounting of crime. And then DC uses the index of crime, which is very similar to NIBRS and UCR. The information presented to you today is the combination of all of those reporting systems. And then for simplicity, we're going to refer to our crimes within the report as Part 1 or Part A offenses or offenses as a whole. I'm sorry, next slide, please. And next slide. As you, it's very good to report that in 2019 we saw a 1% drop in crime, and really, which is incredible, is this is in addition to the 10% over 2018, or the 2018 10% decline. And when you look back to 2015 till today, we've had an 18% drop in crime across the NCR, and that's a very good sign. This is the 6th consecutive year we've seen a decrease in crime across the region. Next slide, please. We look at these crimes as both violent and property crimes, and both of these, property and violent crime, went down, both categories. I also want to take a moment to thank the Police Subcommittee for Investigations. That's headed by Major Kevin Hugart from Prince William County. It's his committee that is the one that compiled this report. While we did see a decrease in crime, we did see an increase in calls for service, 12% increase. And then this is important just to acknowledge that even though we've seen an increase in calls for service, crime continues to go down. And as we talked with the Police Investigative Commanders Committee, some of the reasons they think crime has gone down in 2019 is enhanced community safety awareness campaigns, the harnessing of commercial technologies that we're using to identify criminals and crimes that have occurred, a lot of training, and through COG, we receive a lot of training through our subcommittees for individuals and for departments, and a renewed emphasis on data sharing and open communications between law enforcement. One of the highlights, I think, of the police chief subcommittee is the fact that we do get together monthly and we share information. And then finally, as we've had for a number of years, the See Something, Say Something campaigns and police encouraging communities to report crimes could be a reason for the increased calls for service and also for the decrease in crime, because the more that we can respond to a citizen complaint, the better off we are most likely to be. Next slide, please. We did see a slight crime rate per capita, mostly due to the region's population fluctuation of just under 6 million residents. Crime rate per capita is commonly accepted measure of crime and often serves as a basic indicator of crime trends. And as you see on the screen there, in 2018, it was 16.2 per thousand, and in 2019, it was 16.3. So just a small uptick in crime per capita. Next slide, please. These, you received the report, and these are two projects that we wanted to highlight for you. The first is Project Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, and this was submitted by Prince William County, but we submitted here in this report because this is a project that really shows a regional commitment to fighting crime. And this is a coordination and collaboration with the U.S. Department of Justice. And essentially what this does is it targets violent criminals and gang activity. There's a lot of place-based policing that is encouraged within this program. And then ultimately what happens is when somebody's arrested, there is pre and post-trial heavy monitoring. And so through that partnership, it does show not only individual entities, but across the region, we're using these programs to coordinate, collaborate, and to target those that are doing the most harm to our communities. And then also you can read about the partnering to solve gang-related homicides. There's a great case out of Frederick, Maryland, where through coordination and collaboration between local, federal, and state partners, they were able to indict and arrest an individual involved in gang activity that was responsible for homicide and other criminal activity, along with co-conspirators. So I'm not going to read through those two cases, and those are there for your review. But again, it just shows the regional cooperation between local, state, and federal partners. Next slide, please. These are just four of our focus areas for the COG Police Chiefs Committee. These are our priorities, and as we speak with our subcommittees within the Chiefs Committee, we get our staff and our jurisdictional partners to, at a minimum, focused on these four areas. These four listed priorities are worked on and evaluated on an annual basis. They're really intended to promote a multidisciplinary coordination effort. And then again, by building these partnerships within the region, by exchanging information and coordinating, this is a part of the reason why we think we continue to see a decline in crime throughout the NCR. I think the 5-year trend that we have seen gives us great hope that we can continue the progress we made and build upon the successes we've had over the past 5 years. And just to let you guys know, again, thank you for your support. The COGS Police Chief Subcommittee, we represent a number of agencies, and we're committed to collaborating and identifying new ways to ensure that the region remains a safe place to live, work, and visit. And that's the annual report, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
All right. Thank you very much, Chief Huckler. I do appreciate it. We'll now see what questions and comments we have from Maryland board members. And for everybody's reference, the full report that Chief Huckler abstracted is found on page 37 of your board packet. We'll now move to questions from Virginia board members. Wow, people are really shy today. How about the District of Columbia? This is totally shocking when you consider all kinds of scenarios for how a meeting will go. Having this item with no questions and comments was
Actually,
not a part of
Mr.
it.
Mr. Dorsey, this is Chair Randall. I do have
Oh,
a question.
Phyllis Randall to save the day.
First
Excellent.
of all,
Go
I have
ahead,
two
Phyllis.
questions. One is just for Scott Boggs. Scott, where are my ostrich eggs? That's the first one. Need those ostrich eggs. But the second one is more serious. In Loudoun County, I got a report a couple of days ago that was just chilling. It said that since we've been in COVID, the number of child abuse and neglect cases have dropped by 50%. And while that sounds like a good number, the reason they've dropped so much is because the entity that reports and catches child abuse usually and neglect are teachers. And so the teachers are not catching it, so the teachers are not reporting it. Everything, I'm a bit confused as to how you get more calls, yet the crime rate has dropped. That those two things just don't seem. I paused before I asked the question because I was trying to make the answer in my head myself, but I just couldn't get there. So how are you getting more calls and less crime? That's the first question. And do you think that COVID has played into how many people might report, especially domestic abuse crimes? Now, obviously, I think there probably are less of other things that are happening because of COVID, but my gut tells me, and I have a pretty good gut, that the domestic abuse, the child abuse, the spousal abuse has got to be going up in COVID. When you have people who are not working, they're frustrated, they're in their homes, they're isolated. Were you seeing any difference in those numbers? And by the way, thank you and thank all the sheriffs and police chiefs for what you all are doing.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me address the first question in terms of calls for service. As you know, many of the responses police do not result in an arrest, may not be in relation to criminal activity. So calls for service could be for suspicious activity, alarm calls, things of that nature. And so we like to see increased calls for service in some areas. So if we have a very vigilant community and they're calling out suspicious activity, that's always a good thing. If we have an increased number of alarm calls, that could be for faulty equipment and it's a waste of time and resources from a public safety standpoint. So I would have to direct you back to individual jurisdictions to find out exactly the breakdown of those calls for service. So when we look at the crime report, those are reported crimes that result in a report, that result in possibly an arrest or an investigation. And then you have the calls for service that may not result in an arrest or even a report. It'll be captured in the computer-aided dispatch, but may not result in a police investigation. So calls for service could be for any number of different things. Kids playing in a park, trouble at home for an unruly child that doesn't result in anything than just a interaction with the community. So again, calls for service, really to understand it, you have to break it down and identify what calls for service they are. But overall, we do see an increase in calls for service when we have a community that's informed, when we have a community that has trust with their local police department and wants to call to seek assistance from that police department. And I do think we can extrapolate that in 2019, the trust between our communities and law enforcement is significantly high. And so I think that also breeds itself to calls for service.
That's very good. It's very good.
Again, I would direct any board member back to their local jurisdictions to get a more specific answer. That's a generalization just from a law enforcement professional. As far as your question about COVID, child abuse, domestic violence, again, I would direct you back to the local jurisdictions, but I will say that yes, from the law enforcement profession, from what I'm hearing, from what I'm seeing for discussion with colleagues, is that I think there is an increase in those types of calls because when you keep people locked down in close confines, it gives less relief where people can go or leave a situation. And so I think that can contribute to those types of calls for service increasing. As far as the child abuse, I think what you've stated is what I've also heard, is that this social safety net of our community and our teachers and maybe some other healthcare professionals and things of that nature has been missing this year. And so we may not always catch those from, out. Again, law enforcement's a small piece of that. And all these other entities have had similar, if not more significant challenges than law enforcement in how they're attending to the community.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And again, thank you for all that the police chiefs and all the sheriffs are doing.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. Well, I'm not sure you're quite done yet. Let me just make sure we'll do another round to make sure that there are no other questions or comments which have surfaced. We'll go to Maryland. Commonwealth of Virginia. I have one. So, Mr. Huckler, we focus and prioritize the Part 1 crimes. Those are the ones that, usually concern people the most because of their level of violence and seriousness. But of course, there are other crimes that can affect people and sometimes quite severely that don't fall into the Part 1 category. Can you give us a sense of how that has tracked and trended over the last couple of years?
So there's a big difference between the Part 1 and Part 2 crimes, or when we're looking at NIBRS, it's the Part A offenses and Part B offenses. Part 1 crimes are typically the call for service where the crime has already occurred. And so those are just reported numbers. And without going into a lot of detail, those are what's reported to the police. There's other measurements of Part 1 crimes, the National Crime Survey that assesses community victims of crime where maybe they haven't reported a crime. So that's just a little bit more information. So Part 1 crimes, they occur, the police respond, investigate, either make an arrest or don't make an arrest. The Part B or the Part 2 crimes under UCR and NIBRS are typically the nuisance crimes, the crimes of moral turpitude, initiated activity by police and sheriff's departments, drug crimes, and things of that nature. So it could be looked at two ways. You can look at Part 2 crimes as being an indicator in the community that there is some trouble, for example, drug activity. However, if you see an increase in Part 2 crimes, it could also mean that the police are doing self-initiated activity, which drives those crime numbers up. And so that's just an explanation. I don't have a good idea of whether those numbers are going up or down, because a lot of it depends on the individual agency in terms of their community policing programs, their self-initiated activity. They might do a program where they target a community or individuals for drug activity. And so that could drive the numbers up. I'm certain we could get you that information, but for the report I have in front of me today, I don't have the numbers to tell you whether they're up or down. But again, that would be a very jurisdictional specific number that you'd want to pay attention to, and not necessarily a regional number that I could present here today and say Part 2 crimes are down. That's a good thing, because Part 2 crimes being down may mean our police are not engaged in the community as well as they could or should. So I'll leave it at that, but that's a pretty general explanation of those two categories of crime.
Well, an excellent one. Thank you so much. And, clearly we're looking at from 17 to 18, we had a significant decrease. To see that actually 2019 could continue that decrease is kind of remarkable. So, congratulations to everyone in the committee for the work that they're doing on behalf of our region. We do appreciate it. Seeing no further questions, we thank Chief Huckler. And please extend our thanks to your colleagues on the committee.
Will do. Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Our next agenda item is our last agenda item of the day, and it's a look at our greenhouse gas emissions reduction target and action plan. You all may recall in last month's executive director report, Mr. Bean told us about COG's Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee, CEPC, and its development of a 2030 climate and energy action plan, and that they're considering recommending a 2030 goal for reducing our region's greenhouse gas emissions. So CEPC expects to bring any recommendations for a 2030 goal to this board in October next month. And so to help us understand the issue more before we are asked to consider a significant step forward with a potential recommendation, Chair of CEPC, Penny Gross, who will be supported by COG Director of Environmental Programs, Steve Waltz, will brief us on the issues and the 2030 proposed goal. Ms. Gross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the board knows, I only recently took over as CPC chair after the death of Dan C. from the city of Falls Church. And so you've already outlined some of the information that was also in my talking points. We are presenting background for your consideration when we bring back our recommendations in October. Many COG members have set or are in the process of considering a goal for a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. COG staff therefore analyzed the technical potential to meet a 50% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. CPC will also be recommending an updated climate and energy action plan for 2030. This will set out the recommended practices localities and states can implement to reach our goals. CPC also plans to identify what actions the federal government should take to support our efforts. We have lofty goals in that regard. Our region also was selected as one of 4 U.S. regional climate leaders by Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. This is one of our very interesting pieces. We therefore are using the GCOM framework and technical assistance as we develop our plan. There is more information in the staff memo starting on page 61 of the board packet, but I will turn over the majority of the presentation to COG's Environmental Director, Steve Waltz, who will help us understand these points and walk us through. Steve?
Thank you very much, Councilmember Gross. And this also is following up on information that then CPC Chair Dan Z gave to the COG board in March. At that point in time, he laid out what our plans were. And really, in spite of everything that has happened with the coronavirus and the disruptions, we've been able to move ahead, as we will be reporting on today. So we appreciate both Dan's leadership and then ongoing leadership from Penny Gross and of all the members. If we go to slide 3, it gets a little bit of background on why we're doing this. There's the International Panel on Climate Change, and they are the science-based group that looks at what we need to do to be able to protect ourselves against climate change. They, in 2018 and early 2019, came out with a report saying that we really should be limiting the amount of warming that's happening around the globe in order to avoid the more extreme climate impacts, such as extreme weather, the sea level rise, or in our case, the water level in the Potomac River, loss of ecosystems, and that if we don't do this, it's going to really come back and haunt us. They make the point that this is going to require rapid and far-reaching transitions in the work that we do. And as we will see, our research really shows that it's going to need a lot of work also. Back in 2008, we did set regional greenhouse gas emission goals for 2012, 2020, and 2050. As we'll see, we met the 2012 goals, and we're probably going to fall a little short of the 2020 goals. We're going to use a couple of terms here, and you'll see this in your local planning efforts. And so I'll just give a couple of definitions. When we talk about mitigation, that's really meaning that we're reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions to lessen the impact. And if you hear the term carbon neutral or net zero, what that really means is that both by reducing or eliminating emissions, as well as increasing the amount of carbon that we can store through agriculture and other practices, that we get down to a total net of zero amount of emissions. So let's move on to the next slide, please, to show what we have measured so far. We did a greenhouse gas emissions baseline in 2005. We saw a significant reduction by 2012. where we were trying to meet the goal of 10% below business as usual, which was about equal to 2005, before the emissions were continuing to rise year after year, and we've turned that curve down, although it has tended to level out since 2012. So this points us out that we really need to be doing more as we go along. We've also looked at what drove it down and what has kept it at least level over this time, which we call the drivers of change. We have seen reductions in emissions, particularly from electrical generation, from new buildings being built that are more efficient, and from improved transportation fleet efficiency as new vehicles get put into the fleet. This has been offset by population growth and the growth in the commercial space, and actually it's been offset some by changes in weather. We also see that the largest sources of our greenhouse gas emissions, 51% in the blue and the green, are the built environment, our buildings, and then about 42% is from transportation. So these point out the areas that we really need to focus in on as we're thinking about actions to take ahead. The next slide begins to show us the path that we have been on so far, and then the potential path into the future as we're looking at these goals. If we did more or less a straight line path towards our 80% reduction by 2050 goal, it would mean that we would need to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. There has been a lot of discussion at the local levels across the region and at CPC to say we really need to push a little harder and a little farther. And they're suggesting and evaluating whether the goal should be a 50% reduction by 2030. And they're beginning the discussion about, is the 80% by 2050 goal enough, or should we be following the lead of a number of our different members, such as Frederick City and County and Montgomery County and Arlington and Alexandria and others, to think about carbon neutrality by 2050. So what you'll see in October will be the results of the discussions that CPC is having. Discussions so far have been leaning towards setting the goal of a 50% reduction by 2030. Looking at the next slide, we also are looking at more actively at what we're calling resilience. And resilience is really the ability of our communities to have less of an impact from either the acute storm type of impacts or the chronic impacts, such as the rise in temperatures in the daytime at night, so that we can manage those and have less of an effect. And then if they happen, that we can recover more quickly. It takes a network of people across all of our communities, the individuals, the governments, the institutions, the businesses. It includes that we're going to have to better communicate these risks and do a better job of engaging vulnerable populations. We've gone through a process, and we'll be able to report later on what the risk is. The two biggest risks for us are flooding and extended heat in the summer, but we can be able to have a ranking of those risks as we go through this process. We're also going to be looking to speed up the efforts that we make to improve the resilience of our critical infrastructure, and that there's many reasons to do this, not only to make sure the infrastructure works, but to protect the public health and safety. We also will be putting monitoring measures in place so that we'll know how we're doing over time. The next slide, number 7, is really kind of just a flat chart. And what this shows us is that just as we've seen since 2012, if we don't do anything else, that we're not going to get any better, that the emissions are going to stay where they are, and that we won't reach our goals. That's a real complicated slide, and there's a lot of pieces that we've analyzed, but the bottom line is that if we don't do anything new, it'll remain flat. The next slide shows a little bit more that it's not even across all the different sectors. As we see residential growth and growth in commercial buildings, as we have seen, those emissions will go up, and transportation emissions will continue to go down for a while as the fleet brings more newer cars and more efficient cars into the marketplace. Over the long term to 2050, if we don't do anything, that'll start to go back up. But by 2030, it's about level, but it changes within the various sectors. Moving on to slide 9. Now we've looked at, well, what can we do if we set a 50% goal? And so we've tried to distill these down into 4 main areas of work that each of our members, working with also our state and federal partners to the extent that they're willing to work with us, can do. The 4 main areas include increase the amount of clean, renewable energy sources through the state renewable portfolio standards, through growing the amount of rooftop distributed generation systems through solar co-ops and solarize and other types of systems that are getting put in place. And an important factor is encouraging our corporate partners to be able to be purchasing green power at greater extent. We see that a lot in the IT industry, but not just there. There are other industries across the region who are directly buying green power themselves. Within the transportation sector, while we are seeing some improvements, we need to continue these fleet improvements. We need, if we're going to reach 50%, we're going to need to increase the rate of use of electric vehicles powered by clean electricity sources and increase the use of what kind of transit and what we're referring to as micromobility, scooters and walking and bicycling for the last mile or miles. We're also going to really need to do a lot more to make our buildings more efficient. We've set the goal, or you've set the goal here to have a lot more of the development in the activity centers that have high capacity transit. That's an area that we'll be looking at carefully as we look at and think about what is going to happen out of following coronavirus and seeing where people want to live. But those buildings are built more efficiently and the people living in them have less need for the energy used in transportation. We will need to move to have really all new construction be what's called net zero by 2030, which means that they'll generate power as well as use power and net out to zero, and then do a lot more commercial building retrofits. And then we'll have to do better on our waste management and have less go into the types of management practices that cause pollution, such as landfills that generate methane, or even the waste energy plants that generate emissions. So we can get to the 50% reduction. It shows us how, but it will be a pretty big lift. Moving on to the last slide to be able to move through quickly. This shows the timeline that we have been through and that we're planning to get through. As we mentioned, we've been working on this for a while, and Mr. Z presented back to you in the spring. Since then, we have been taking it to our public advisory committee and our technical committees and rolling our sleeves up and digging in deep into the analysis. We have gone out for a lot of comments. We have revised our scenarios based upon the input we've received. We're making this presentation to you today. And then CPC later in this month will be reviewing this and making its recommendation to you as to what the 2030 interim regional goal should be. So we hope that you would act on that in October. Then November, we will finish the whole plan and bring it to CPC for their review. And then, as Penny mentioned, we did sign on as one of the Global Covenant of Mayors regional scale climate leaders. And we hope to be the first region in the U.S. to fully meet their standards for climate planning and give us all this framework that we can move together strongly to meet our goals. And with that, that's all I had. And Ms. Gross, if there's anything you'd like to add, or maybe we can take questions.
Thank you, Steve. Before we take questions, resilience is one of my favorite words these days, has been for quite some time. And there's a lot of resilience that is built into the plan. There's a lot of commitment to, and a lot of work for our jurisdictions. If you look at slide 9, it really does hit many of the important items that are on the COG's agenda already: transportation, buildings, especially housing, and then zero waste. I think in talking to some of our waste folks here in Fairfax County, there's an awful lot of information going on, but it's going to have to be made to the ordinary citizen to understand what to do. And that, but I think that's probably going to be one of the easier ones we can do. You will see all of much of this next month in a resolution, but we wanted to tee it up so that we can have some of the discussion today instead of waiting until October for all the discussion. Mr. Chairman, that I believe is the extent of our report. And Steve would be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gross and Mr. Waltz. We'll now have questions and comments from Maryland board members. How about from Virginia board members? I'll just jump in.
I have a question. Sorry.
All right, Ms. Briskman, why don't you go ahead and lead us off, and I'll pick up a little later after everyone has had their say. Go ahead.
So, in Loudoun County, as I'm sure most people know on this board, we have a lot of data centers, and in the back of my head, I'm always concerned about what these data centers are doing to the environment and what can we do to ask the builders to improve them, so that they don't hurt our climate as much. Did you look at all into specifically, like, I don't know where those fit in your categories. Like, are they considered a building, like an office building? Are they, and then, I don't know, I think the county could use some advice on how to improve that.
So those are considered commercial buildings in our inventory. And so Loudoun, therefore, has seen substantial growth in the total amount of electricity consumed in its commercial sector because of that. But this is where we think those companies are stepping up and taking a leadership role in buying green power, so that even though the amount of electricity they're using is going up, the emissions may not be. We don't have a good way to measure that yet. And we've been in discussions with a industry group of the data center operators to try and get better information about what they're doing in green power purchasing. One of the things, for example, that counties could do as they are approving these is ask the companies to report back as to their green power purchases, because they've all made very significant pledges. And you may want to know in approving them that they're not having the great environmental footprint, and you could ask them to report back. They're doing other things also, particularly in Loudoun County, about reusing what's called the purple pipe water out of the Loudoun Water Wastewater Treatment Plant, so that they're not using fresh water for cooling. And so there's a number of things that they are doing, and we need to be able to both encourage that and then get a better understanding to reflect that in our measurements.
Okay, great. Any other questions from Virginia board members?
Thank you.
How about questions, comments from the District of Columbia? All right, seeing no questions, again, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Penny. One of the reasons that we wanted to give you this month to hear this as an informational item, in addition to the very important and layered information that was presented today, we do want to make sure that when we consider any recommendations from CPC, that everyone is prepared to act in the moment, having had a period of time to really think about the implications of what we're likely to be asked to do. And that is to be very aggressive in goal setting, which will necessarily, if we're to have fidelity to that goal, mean doing not only things differently, but more intensively, and recognizing that that's going to, challenge us in a lot of different ways. But I think we're all of the same mind that the challenge requires that we be aggressive. But we do want to make sure that as you enter into consideration of any updated goals, that you recognize that it's going to mean that redevelopment comes with it a level of sustainability that maybe our jurisdictions are not equipped to require with current processes, and that could in fact add costs to redevelopment, which may butt up against other goals that we may have for housing affordability and other things, that it's going to require that we have fidelity to plans that are going on with other regional bodies like the TPB, which are looking at, among other things, how to expand walk sheds so that we can better take advantage of transit that already exists. The point is, this is layered and requires our full commitment to doing lots of different things if we're going to have aggressive goal setting for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So chew over this over the next month. So hopefully everybody will be fully prepared to not only consider CPC's recommendation, but to understand what that'll mean from their own jurisdictions. Any other comments that on this item that have not been raised? Seeing none, I am happy to be able to yield back a few minutes of time since we have no other business on our agenda, and wish you all a very happy September 9th and farewell.
Bye, everybody.